So last time we finished up by showing that the Earth's climate is in fact changing and the planet is warming up. We showed some data to back that up, but I also was talking in broad terms about how the tropics are expanding and the stratosphere is cooling and the glaciers are melting and the sea level is rising, all as evidence that the Earth's climate is warming up. When I interact with people and they want to know my thoughts on climate change, I like to kind of divide it up into three separate topics. And the first is, what do we know about the Earth's climate? Is it warming? Is it cooling? This is based upon data, it's based upon fact, and it's independent of the cause of that change. And then once I establish that there is a lot of evidence showing that the climate is in fact changing and that it's warming, then I can move into the discussion of what is causing the Earth's climate to change? And is it being caused by humans or is it natural? And I like to talk about how in a perfect world you would have two Earths, one with humans, one without. You have exact similar conditions and you run your experiment forward and you can see exactly what the presence of humans on a planet would do. But we don't have a second Earth. So what we have to do is we create virtual Earths using computer models. And the way that we do with that is to create these independent models from different research groups around the planet that include all of the physics and processes that we understand are important for the climate system, including the positive feedback mechanisms and the negative feedback mechanisms. And then we can basically run them backwards to see if they can reproduce past climates. And once they have been successfully being able to reproduce the past climate, then we can then run them in the forward direction to see how the climate responds. And then you can do experiments by changing the greenhouse gas concentrations and see exactly how the climate would change. And by performing these types of experiments, you can actually see what fraction of the current warming is due to the increasing carbon dioxide gas concentrations and other greenhouse gas concentrations. And you can predict how those concentrations might impact the temperature of the planet going forward. And there are more than 20 of these global climate simulation models, and they all basically show the same thing with different levels of certainty and different levels of different things that are going on a regional basis. So if you talk to atmospheric scientists, almost all of us are convinced that the changes that we're seeing in the Earth's climate are in fact caused by human actions, because you can't get the observed warming that we have seen without having the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations, which are caused by human activities. So lastly, we'll move into number 3 of the debate, which is what action should we take if the climate change is being caused by humans? And this is actually a role where you have policy and society are more important, because as a society we have to determine what world we want to live in and what actions are worthwhile taking in order to prevent the predicted outcomes. And by breaking it apart in this, you can actually have a better conversation with people and actually find out exactly where your differences in opinion lie. And it just makes things less confrontational and a better debate all the way around. So the world's scientists have come together, and the United Nations has put together a framework to try and determine what the human response to changing climate should be. And the first one of these agreements was actually the Kyoto Protocol, and it was completed in December of 1997, and it was adopted in Kyoto, Japan. And it basically commits all the parties of the world that signed the protocol by setting in internationally binding emission reduction targets. And part of the Kyoto Protocol is recognizing that developing countries are the ones that are principally responsible for the increasing of the greenhouse gas concentrations over the last 150 years. and that they necessarily have to bear the burden associated with reducing the emissions of these greenhouse gases. The key provisions, it was actually pretty modest. It was actually, the goal was to reduce the worldwide emissions to 5% below the 1990 levels. That was all that it really said. It didn't say how those reductions would occur. It didn't stipulate exactly where that would happen in the world. It just said global emissions were to be reduced by 5% below 1990 levels. And then there were some amendments to the Kyoto Protocol in 2020 in Doha that was stipulating further reductions. And the framework that was put together basically allows countries to do emissions trading. It allows them to do joint implementation. So if we want to keep burning fossil fuels here in the United States, we could partner with Brazil to reforest the rainforest of the Amazon. And then with the net emissions could be less because of the uptake of carbon dioxide by the forest that we fund and plant. It also tries to develop new technologies that can reduce our dependence upon fossil fuels. The participating countries, there were 192 countries that were participating, and there are only 3 countries that did not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. That was the United States, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Canada had initially signed but ended up withdrawing in 2011. So what were some other key outcomes of the Kyoto Protocol? Well, it wanted to prioritize energy efficiency. The easiest way to reduce emissions is actually to become more energy efficient and use less and doing the same things, and you don't have to change your lifestyle. And a lot of people like that option. It also encourages the protection of carbon sinks. That would be forests, biomes that are actually big sinks for carbon. Tries to promote sustainable agriculture, and it tries to fund research and development on renewable energy sources that would reduce our dependence upon fossil fuels, and also encouraging research into carbon sequestration, which is the actual removal and long-term storage of carbon, which would have gone to the atmosphere. And lastly, there were 2 things. They wanted to phase out all of the incentives and the tax exemptions and the subsidies that were going to the fossil fuel industries. And basically, there's a whole bunch of those sorts of things in terms of incentives that the governments have. And then lastly, they want to try and reduce methane emissions through recovery and use in waste management. Landfills are actually a big source of methane to the atmosphere. And if you set up a capture system, you can actually recycle that methane. And methane's a pretty powerful greenhouse gas. And if you can capture it and reuse it, you actually prevent long-term increase in methane concentrations. So you've also probably heard a lot about the Paris Climate Agreement, which occurred in 2016. It was signed by 195 countries, including the US, but the US did withdraw in 2020. I suspect that the new administration will probably re-enter the United States into the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Paris Climate Agreement has slightly different goals than the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol was focusing in on emissions, and the Paris Climate Agreement is focusing on outcomes. Basically trying to do whatever's necessary in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or through carbon sequestration to keep the climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius warming, and with the ultimate goal of trying to keep it less than 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. And the methodologies that we employ to try and achieve these goals should not threaten our food production is one of the key things. So we want to make sure that we still have enough food for all of the inhabitants of the planet. And The Paris Climate Agreement also incentivizes low greenhouse gas emission technology, so it continues with that theme of research and development. It also has a 20-20-20 strategy, which will help move us toward the goal of keeping climate change to less than 2 degrees C. And one of those is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 20%. We want to increase our renewable energy market share to 20% and increase energy efficiency by 20%. And all of these will help move us toward our goal of mitigating the ultimate amount of climate change which we have due to the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels.